So if we look at as a top-level overview of what OpenAPI or Swagger 2.0 looked like, if you look at the root level, you can see there's a bunch of objects, which makes the root itself very complicated, very loaded, and we wanted to just try and make it easier to write and just easier to find things, right? So we ended up moving to a completely new and simplified structure, and you can even see in terms of like color schemes in the diagram. So things like definitions, parameters, and responses, and security definitions went out of the components part. The produces and consumes disappeared, and we'll cover that in a bit. And it's somewhat inside the path today. The host, base path, and schemes have been condensed into one object called servers. And yeah, that's it. Right now, if you look at the top-level document, it looks a lot cleaner, and it's much easier to navigate through. And if we talked about reusability, right? So the components actually now holds everything that's reusable in the spec. We increased the number of reusable objects from 4 to 9. Some of them are new objects that we introduced to the spec, which again we'll cover in a bit, like links and callbacks. We added examples and headers, which were still, they did exist in 2.0, but now you can actually reuse those. And we also, if we talked about naming before, we also renamed some of the components to make it just easier to understand that this is what they are. So definitions is now schemas. For those of you who know, we used to refer to definitions as the schema object. So we just wanted to use the same name for everything. And the same thing happened to security definitions, changed to security schemes because that's the name of the object itself. Yeah, now we'll move on to changes to parameters, which are quite a bit. Sorry about that. So we introduced a new parameter type, cookie. This is, again, it doesn't mean that we actually advocate using cookie parameters, but there are existing APIs out there that do use cookies, and they need to be able to document that. So now they can. We did end up removing 2 parameter types, which are body and form data, and we introduced a new construct called request body, which again we'll cover in just a bit. One very big change is that we actually allow you to use any kind of even complex types for describing these parameters. So if you look at, if you see the example to the right, you can see that we actually use a query parameter to define coordinates, and we say that it's serializable as a JSON object, and it has these attributes. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to cover. Yeah. Okay, yeah, content negotiation. So content negotiation includes both the payloads and the responses. Okay, so we'll cover both. In terms of request bodies, so like I said before, we eliminated the form data and body parameters, and we introduced a new construct called request body. It's very similar to a parameter, but you can only have one of it, and it pretty much describes the payload of the request. Form data is kind of got melded into that. There are ways to describe form data, and we do use some sort of a JSON schema to describe different parts of the form data payload. As part of that, we ended up also improving the file upload support, right? So you can easily describe arrays of files, which you couldn't have before. You can define the type of files that you want to upload, which again you couldn't have done before. you can also define, because we ended up eliminating the consumes in this, using this, and now you can define multiple media types, and for each media type a different schema, or and different examples. Okay, so it does allow you to describe your API a lot more accurately, especially if you use well, sometimes people use versioning in the media type, right? So you can define different versions for different schema for different versions, or if you want to the structure of, I don't know, JSON and XML are completely different, then you can specify that, which you couldn't have done before. So there's no longer consumes. You explicitly have to specify which media type you end up using, and you can, of course, use wildcards to specify a range. The same thing actually applies to responses. Okay, so in the same way we eliminated producers, and in responses you can also specify the different media types, different examples. And one other thing that we added to responses is that if up until now you could have specified specific response codes, now you can define ranges. Now the ranges are still, you know, everything that falls under 300 or everything that falls under 400, but it's still useful, especially if you want to specify something more generic. Okay, callbacks. So callbacks is one of our new features. We had and callbacks, as you can imagine, they allow you to describe async APIs, asynchronous APIs. You know, whether it's webhooks or anything like that. The one major difference in terms of callbacks is that when you specify the API, you end up actually describing what the client is supposed to implement as well in order for the webhooks to work. The URL itself is based on expressions. So we introduced a new expression language to the spec, which is used in several places, and this is one of them. I invite you all to read it in the spec. We're not going to dive into those details on the webinar. And in terms of the actual definition of what a callback looks like, we just reuse the same path item object, which is just a way to describe different get, post operations and parameters, responses, and all that. It's pretty much the same structure to define that the operation itself. Okay, we're moving on to the next new feature, which I find, let's say, the most exciting one. You know, everything is important, but the links will hopefully introduce a new concept to describing APIs. So basically, links are a way to describe during your design, right? Relationships between responses and other operations, which allow you to pretty much traverse the API. Okay. Now, a lot of people, when they hear something like that, they think, oh, this is hypermedia. So no, this is not hypermedia, because hypermedia is done at runtime. You get the information as part of the response itself, and in this case, and hypermedia in that sense can be very dynamic, so that the links that you get can change for every single request. In our case, we're talking about something that's done during the design of your API, so you're defining what kind of links exist. They do not exist as part of the API itself, so you don't get any additional metadata in the response to be able to follow those links. So pretty much without the API definition itself, you don't have any other information about the links. Okay, so you need that API definition. But the idea is that you can, you know, you can say it saves traffic in terms of what actually comes and goes, but still the clients will be able to follow those links by following the definition itself. And using the same expression language that we mentioned before in the callbacks, you can actually get details from the request itself, even from the request that you end up sending, from the response, from the request, I also mean not just the payload itself or the parameters, but also, let's say, which operation you did, and so on. And you can manipulate all those with this expression language to decide what kind of parameters you end up sending to the next operation. So just to give an example, let's say you get a list of users, okay, as you have a get users, and you have a get user address operation, right? So you can extract from the list of users each user ID and know how to use next URL to get the address for that user, right? So that's a link, for example, that you can define. There are no limits to the kind of links that can be defined. And we're really looking forward to see what kind of definitions come out of that, and based on feedback from the community, we hope to evolve and expand this feature further. It does, in a sense, it does allow you to define hypermedia type APIs if you want to, but it's not meant to replace it, and it's not meant to compete with it. It's just a different way to specify relationships between operations. I'll just add one last thing about the links. Obviously, a lot of the logic here needs to be done by the clients again. And this is a great way even in tooling, you can utilize that to automate the process. Okay, and we can when we get to talk about our tools, we'll cover that a bit. Yeah. Okay. Okay, examples. Yes. So examples seems like a very simple feature, but we actually ended up doing quite a massive change after a relatively public version of the spec, and it was based on community feedback. So that goes to show how important community feedback is to us. A lot of people claim and say, and rightfully so, that examples are really important to document your API. And it's a lot of times not enough to just have one example. You want to be able to describe multiple examples for multiple use cases. So we ended up actually giving you that option. So you can have an array for each media type that we mentioned before. You can have an array of examples. You can have them as named examples. So if you want to have like a minimal example and an expanded one, or different use cases, you can do that. You can attach a description to every one of the examples. And one additional thing is we added is, so instead of just embedding the value itself as part of the example, that works well. Maybe if it's a JSON or maybe XML, YAML, things that are more textual. But let's say you want to provide an image as an example, right? So you can actually reference an external example and use that for your needs. So the examples are extremely more flexible now, and they do support reusability. And these kind of examples do exist in request bodies and responses. In schemas, it's slightly different. You can only have one example, mostly because schemas can behave differently in different media types. So it made more sense to be able to describe the examples in the different locations, and by making them reusable, you can actually there's no concern about having to repeat the same example over and over again in multiple locations. The last big feature that we're going to cover is security definitions. We have made quite a few changes to that. So the structure itself is relatively similar to what we had before. We didn't really change the core structure, but we ended up making some things more clear and some things more powerful. So for those of you who have dealt with OAuth 2 in previous versions, you probably know that the names of the flows didn't necessarily make sense, and it wasn't so easy to understand which one you actually need to use. So we changed that, and now the names of the flows actually follow the OAuth 2 spec. So, no confusion there. And you can also specify multiple flows under one security definition, okay? So, or one security scheme. So again, it's not a very common use case, but some people still need it, so they can easily do that. We introduced support for OpenID Connect, so that's brand new. And I think the last part is going to be interesting to a lot of people. So instead of just having basic authentication, we changed that to let's say HTTP-based authentication, and there are official schemes that are defined. Basic is one of them, Digest is another, and Bearer is a third. And when it comes to Bearer, that actually allows you, we even allow you to specify what kind of bearer token is being used. So for everyone who uses JWT, you can actually describe it a lot more easily now. So yeah, that's great news for a lot of our users. Okay, but still, there are a few additional changes that we can cover really briefly. And again, I'm just going to say this still doesn't cover all the changes in the spec. So now you probably know that before in the previous version we supported GFM or GitHub flavored Markdown in descriptions. We changed that to ConeMark, which is now becoming an official standard for Markdown, including GitHub are moving to that, or they have moved to that. So there is that. Extended JSON schema support, it's a huge thing, but in short, we added support for any of, one of, and not. I'll also say that we still don't support null as a value, but we did introduce a new construct to say that something is nullable, so you can still specify that it can have a null value. Another important thing is something that we mentioned briefly at the beginning. We changed the whole schemes base path and host, and we introduced a new construct called server. Now server just encompasses all those things, but now you can define multiple servers and give each one a description, and you can actually template those servers. So if, for example, you want to have multiple servers in different geographical locations, then you can specify that the prefix of the host is templated and give a set of possible values to that. We did add support for the trace method. Again, it's not very commonly used in APIs, but for those of you who do, you can use it now. And we have decided, and that's also a change. We have decided that to follow more the HTTP spec, and in general, payloads are not supported by operations that are defined by the HTTP spec as having no defined meaning to payloads. Okay, so it's not that the spec when the spec says that it has no meaning, but it has no defined meaning. So things like delete and get can no longer be defined with payloads. Yeah, so as you can imagine and understand 3.0 is a really big change from 2.0 in terms of the structure, and it's pretty much it's a breaking change all over, right? So if you want to convert 2.0 specification to a 3.0 one, it will require some work, right? So you can see that, like we talked, definitions, parameters, responses, security definitions all moved under the components, and some of them have been renamed. You will need to replace the schemes and base paths with the servers. Parameters need to be restructured, because even if you have the simple text or simple simple primitives parameters, you still need to change the structure just a bit, because the schema is it always exists. Yeah, so let's say responses have changed quite a bit, security, as you can see, and the only thing that mostly didn't change is the schema. So if you had schemas from 2.0, you can pretty much take them as is and use them in 3.0. The only gotcha there is that if you did use the discriminator in 2.0, the structure of that did change in 3.0, so you would have to make changes to that. But beyond that, anything else is just the same.